Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to ASISTA and Ujima's webinar on bias, equity, and the impact of anti-Blackness on immigrant survivors. My name is Kelly Head, and I'm a staff attorney at ASISTA. And we would like to thank the U.S. Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women, because without their support, today's webinar would not be possible. And I'll now turn it over to my co-presenter to introduce herself.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ayana Wallace, pronoun she, her, and I am the Training and Technical Assistance Manager with Ujima, Inc. I'm glad to be here with you all today.
Next slide, please. So just to get everyone engaged and participating this afternoon, we have a few icebreakers for you. You can answer one or all of these questions. Feel free to put the answers in the chat. The questions are, what are you looking forward to this year? What are you grateful for today? And tell us about your pets. So please feel free to participate in the chat, and we look forward to getting to know each other over the next 2 hours. Summer sailing, beach, and sunshine. That's awesome. For spring, yes, finally, spring has definitely sprung. Do plants count as pets? I think so. I think they do. Wow, someone's still experiencing snow. Wow, I'm curious to know where you are, Monica. That's pretty late for snow. Two dogs, looking forward to having gathering with friends again. That's great. Awesome. Thank you, everyone, for sharing that. Next slide, please. And Ayana, did you want to do the learning objectives?
Sure. So we have a lot of objectives that we want to get to through this conversation. So definitely make sure you're still participating in the chat as we go through. But today we're going to be looking at and examining the role the intersectionality plays in Black immigrant survivors' lives and experiences with violence. We're going to explore and envision some strategies that shift power and better center Black immigrant survivor experiences when receiving services. We're going to identify some examples of anti-Blackness in the US immigration system. And this is where you all will definitely come in clutch to this conversation. We're going to be talking through more and really setting the groundwork for understanding anti-Blackness in the criminal legal system and its effects on Black survivors of DV. Understand the intersections between the criminal, legal, and immigration systems as well. Do a little bit more around unpacking, again, the impact of anti-Blackness on immigrant survivors, and also looking at misogynoir, which is something specific to Black women and femmes, and then also talk through some practical tips when working with Black immigrant survivors. So we're trying to definitely have this be a nuanced and layered conversation. And as much as you all can add to the conversation to support each other as well in learning and in growth is really important. So next slide. So I'm just going to give a quick background about who I am and where I'm coming from. So again, my name is Ayana Wallace, pronoun she, her. I'm the TTA manager with Ujima, Inc. Ujima, Inc. is a national resource center in the Black community, so similar to Casa de Esperanza or Esperanza United now, formerly Casa de Esperanza, or the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. We over at Ujima are a culturally specific, nationally designated resource center, and our work focuses in on the needs, realities, lived experiences, barriers, strengths, etc., of Black women and girls and of the Black community as a whole. So our mission and vision, our vision is to create a world where Black women and girls are valued, respected, safe, and free from violence at the many intersections where it lies. And our mission is to mobilize the community, our entire communities, to respond to and end violence, and then also to serve as a resource to survivors of violence, but also be a resource to advocates, service providers, the community as a whole, law enforcement, faith communities, really everyone that is invested and engaged in this work and engaged in ending violence, specifically intimate partner violence at the intersections for Black survivors. Next slide. So what does Ujima actually do? Of course, feel free to check out our website or to connect with me later for more information. But generally, our aim is to always give voice back to Black women and girls, whether it's through research or writing or workshops like this, to make sure that we're providing a supportive community and making sure that we're engaging all persons in our community, because we can't leave folks out. So making sure to engage men, women, children, folks that are LGBTQIA+, queer, gender nonconforming. And then some of the types of strategies that we employ include policy and legislation. We have a research and evaluation work group composed of, I think it's about 10 researchers and professors across the country that do a lot of our writing and research for us now, and also do a lot around outreach and capacity building, as well as education, public awareness, and training. So we'll go out across the country, talk in informal spaces, talk in institutional spaces, and really just, again, making sure to engage folks at many different levels. Next slide. Some areas of focus, specific areas of focus for us include sexual violence, domestic violence, community violence, sex and labor trafficking, and institutional and structural violence as a whole. So really all the things that we can, and really all the ways that violence intersects in Black women and girls' lives, we like to explore. Next slide. And I did want us to start out with just some simple workshop agreements, just so we have a baseline for how we're going to communicate and how we're going to operate in space together, in this space in particular. First one is active listening. I know with workshops, especially virtual workshops, it's really easy to get distracted because folks are sending you 50 emails or calling you. But as much as possible, let's make sure to stay in this space together. Of course, if you need to take a call or need to step out, feel free to do that. Just rejoin the conversation when you can. Be present, silence that internal chatter. So my mom always says, I know you hear me, but are you listening? And she is very much a lawyer, both my parents are. So sometimes she knows that I'll try to get my rebuttal crafted really quickly and get my point across instead of fully and deeply listening and absorbing to what she's saying. So let's just try to be present in what the person is sharing or even in the chat. Be open. So remember that all of us are coming to this work with different experiences, lived experiences, experiences with survivors, different lenses. And so for some of us, even the language might be very new. For others, you might be deeply entrenched in this work and it's very familiar, but make sure to be open in the space. Same thing with pushing through your growing edge. There's always something to learn, even if something seems like, oh, this is 101 to me. There's always space to learn and grow. Respectfully challenge each other. So we do not all have to agree. Of course, we shouldn't or we wouldn't, because we have different lived experiences and perspectives. But if you are challenging something or disagree even, let's just make sure to do it respectfully to each other in the chat. Lean in and lean out. So really for this, lean into the conversation. This is a space intentionally designed to have this conversation and to really amplify some of the themes that we're going to talk through today. And then probably most important is to continue to have these conversations. There's no point in us sitting in this workshop together and taking the time if the conversations are going to end here. If anyone would like to add or expand on any of these workshop agreements, please feel free to put that in the chat now and we will add them in. Otherwise, we will keep pushing through. Next slide. And you can still add them even if I've moved on. I have the chat pulled up, so I'm trying to keep an eye on it as well. All right. So what we're going to do is we are going to just give some baseline understandings, baseline definitions, just to make sure we're all on the same page, we're all set on the same stage. So this word here comes up, let's dive right into it, race. What is race? Where did it come from? Why should we talk about it? Why do we need to talk about it? Give me your thoughts in the chat. Historically, what has race meant to folks? All right, so I see some things coming up. It has to do with systemic racism. All right, what else? What's race? Where did it come from? Why is it important to think about with language? Control has to do with control, a way for some to have power over others, the way we categorize each other, different skin tone, colors. Race is an invention by white folks, baked into virtually every institution in the US, a way to otherwise, a way for others to create power structures. A lot of great answers. Let's go ahead and give an answer for that definition. So I saw a couple answers and you're absolutely right. So race is a social political construct. Basically, it's a made up thing. Because we know that before race was encoded into our law and our language back in, I think, the 1580s or 1680s, it might be, folks had looked a lot different for a lot longer than that before it was actually encoded into our law and our language, right? Like we know folks did. So it was a made up thing. And still, it's both socially constructed and culturally enforced. So race can mean a lot of different things to different people. Historically, it's been used, or generally it's been used to talk about physical differences, talk about skin color differences, even had folks thinking that Black people, I'm gonna give the example, Black people's brains were smaller. We had fewer or different nerve receptors because we were Black, because our skin was darker. There's a lot that has to do with race, but at the end of the day, it's a social political construct and still is socially enforced or culturally enforced. Next slide. So race and ethnicity though, that language tends to get conflated, right? When folks say race, oftentimes they also think they're talking about ethnicity, but that can be very different. So ethnicity is a population whose members identify with each other on the basis of common nationality or shared cultural traditions, or shared such as beliefs, languages, clothing, food traditions. So my quick example of how race and ethnicity are different, my husband, for example, we both identify as Black. I identify as Black American. He identifies as Haitian American. Two different experiences culturally, different languages, religious practices, food practices, hair practices even. So to understand that even different understandings of different experiences around colonialism, emancipation, so very different lived experiences, even though we both still identify as Black. Next slide. We see this many times when we think about ethnic expressions in the Hispanic or Latinx communities as well. So Hispanic usually refers to those who speak Spanish, while Latino or Latina usually refers to geography. So someone being from Latin America, the Caribbean, South America, or Central America. But for many, the usage has become interchangeable, even though typically it's regional. Next slide. But for example, it's important to think about the differences with ethnicity when we're talking about people, right? You let folks self-identify. So someone from Brazil is Latinx, but not Hispanic. And why is that? Put that in the chat. And then someone from Spain is Hispanic, but not necessarily Latinx. And even more so, right, because they speak Portuguese. Thank you, Lupita. But even more so, some folks don't want to be identified as Latinx or Hispanic. There's new language, new terms coming up, right? And so it's important that we understand when we think about ethnicity, there are Afro-Caribbean folks, there are Afro-Latino folks, there are African people. And so to understand that language is fluid as well, but we need to specify sometimes what we're talking about, it can go a long way. Next slide. And so I'm not going to delve into these next two slides too much, but I really want to narrow in on the fact that, again, definitions change, understandings of people, of race, of ethnicity change. So Black people, by US Census definition, refers to people having origins in any of the Black sub-Saharan racial groups in Africa. But again, there are Black people, we are diasporic. Again, I identify as Black American. I do not identify as African American anymore, even though I did growing up. So again, letting folks self-identify, letting folks self-express is really important. Next slide. Again, just understanding that the definitions of racial Blackness have, again, over time changed. The language around it has changed. For some, the preferred language is people of color. For others, currently it's BIPOC. For others still, they just want to say no, Black or Indigenous or Latin. They really want things to be defined. But it's important to talk to folks and really ask folks what they're looking for and what makes them feel most comfortable. Next slide. All right, so we went through the first couple tough ones, right? Race, ethnicity. What's culture? Can you have more than one culture? Is it important to actually talk about culture or understand it? What are your thoughts? So yes, culture can inform behavior, has to do with shared experiences and expectations. You can have more than one. You can be raised in many different cultures. Sometimes it might be a religious aspect. Thank you, right? Let's go ahead and give that definition. So culture generally can be defined as a body of beliefs, ideas, and ideals used for cohesion and conformity. Absolutely true. You can exist and live and navigate more than one culture. You could have been raised with more than one culture. We have work culture, we have our friends culture, we have campus culture. There are a whole bunch of different ways to exist. And it does absolutely right, have a lot to do sometimes with your race, ethnicity, region, religion, but it's fluid again. Go ahead and end there for me. And culture many times is defined, or the roles or expectations even are defined for relationships, families, and workplaces. This is sort of the guidelines that set the stage on how we're supposed to operate in society with each other and with community. So race is a social political construct, but culturally enforced. Ethnicity are the ways that people self-identify, and culture can be thought of as really the ties that bind folks together. Next slide. All right, prejudice. So the next couple, these are sort of highlighted words, right? They catch our attention. What's prejudice? Because we hear this all the time. We might have experienced it, but it's sometimes difficult to explain to folks. What's prejudice? A preconceived opinion, treating someone differently or worse because of the way they look, stereotypes that influence how you treat others, internal bias, prejudging someone based on characteristics. I'll take all that. Great. Let's go ahead and enter for me. Might be unfair treatment. So prejudice are preconceived opinions without just grounds and before sufficient knowledge. And that can be either implicit or explicit. Let's hold that and let's go to the next slide. So bias. If prejudice is a preconceived opinion without just grounds and before sufficient knowledge, what then might bias be, and how is it slightly different? So it might have to do with acting on prejudice. Okay, what else? Treatment versus belief, maybe. All right, what else? Bias can can favorably or unfavorably influence someone. Okay, let's go ahead and give the definition, because all of those are correct in a different way. The way you view someone, internalized ideas of how you treat someone. So bias is a tendency, inclination, or prejudice toward or against someone or something. Biases are often based on stereotypes rather than actual knowledge of an individual or circumstance. So the way I think about the difference is, let's say Kelly invites me to a St. Patrick's Day party. She's like, Ayana, I know you love to go out. I know you love to eat. You love to dance. You love a good time. Come to the St. Patrick's Day party with me. It's going to be a blast. There are going to be some leprechauns there, and they're always fun. And I say, no, Kelly, I don't want to go to the party because I've only ever heard bad things about leprechauns. My cousin dated a leprechaun once, and I heard he was just trouble. They're stingy. They're greedy. All they worried about is money. I just don't want to deal with it. That's prejudice. I don't actually have really any basis to go with that. Again, things I've heard, things I might have seen on TV, things I might have read in books, but no actual lived experience with leprechauns with those people. We have the same conversation. Kelly, Ayana, let's go to this party. It's going to be great. And I say, no, Kelly, I'm not going, because remember last year when we went, those leprechauns were there and they were super rowdy and they were all the things I thought they were going to be, all the things I've seen on TV. That's slightly different because I may have had some slight experience, even though it was largely based in my preconceived opinions or that prejudice. It was largely based in assumptions or stereotypes. And so that's the slight difference for me between, or the way I think about it, between prejudice and bias. And so it's important, though, when we think about prejudice and bias, to also think about just generally experiences that we have with people, experiences that we have with Black immigrant survivors, experiences that we have with other advocates. Next slide. And then stereotypes, something that we hear about or know a little bit more in depth because we've learned it better. But stereotypes, let's give the definition for that. So stereotypes are widely held but fixed and oversimplified images or ideas of a particular type of person, group, or thing. And my quick example is, I think of stereotypes in the Black community, the stereotype that all Black people like fried chicken. I'm sure many of us have heard that. Now, while fried chicken is delicious and many people do enjoy it, not all Black people prescribe to Southern Black American food traditions. I know one of my best friends, her family's from Grenada. They don't eat fried chicken on holidays, they eat saltfish and ackee. It's not accounting for the fact that many Black people across the world don't eat meat. They might be vegetarian or vegan. It might be tied to their religious practices. It doesn't account for the many people that, again, just culturally don't prescribe to those same things. And so to simply say or oversimplify the notion that, oh, all Black people show up in this way is a stereotype. And we can see it in many different areas or many different arenas, right? Next slide. Oh yeah, and stereotypes, again, which many of us do understand this, are largely derived from pop culture, music, movies, media, but you learn stereotypes from books, learn it from your family and your friends as well. Next slide. And so the term misogynoir is a term that was coined by queer Black feminist and scholar and professor Moya Bailey back in 2010 to describe the specific ways in which racism and misogyny combine to further oppress Black women. So the ways in which I think about it is, how is Black womanhood and misogyny colliding? What's the impact? What's the explosion? What's the experience? And so for me, and feel free to give some examples if you have some thoughts around what misogynoir might look like or how it has shown up or how it's shown up for Black survivors. But for me, a clear example is back in 2004, Don Imus feeling entitled enough to call the Black women on the Rutgers basketball team nappy-headed hoes on live radio. Like, that's misogynoir. The constant and still very ongoing attacks of former First Lady Michelle Obama, who was called everything from classless to mannish to ghetto to uneducated, even though she was one of the most educated First Ladies we've had in our history. That's misogynoir. The fact that Tarana Burke, who was the founder of the Me Too movement, was left out of the conversation initially. And so I think it was Alyssa Milano or some other superstar basically said, hey, what's going on? Why are we leaving her out of this conversation? Why are we leaving her off of magazine covers, out of reports, right? That's misogynoir. And so to understand that it exists in a general sense, but also exists within systems, it exists within service provision as well, is something to really pick apart and really do some deep dive into, so that we're not recreating harmful cycles in spaces that have been set up to actually support survivors, right? So I see a comment, Liz said, the way Justice Brown Jackson was questioned compared to other nominees, right? Yeah, so thinking and really understanding how it might show up in service provision, how it might show up in impact rapport building as well, is really something to take account to. Next slide. So the question, I saw a question, does misogynoir include other non-white women? Not, so misogynoir is specific to Black women, but anti-Blackness could impact other non-white women. We see that a lot as well. So some racialized tropes that I think are really important for folks to understand and be able to potentially even unpack in their programs or with survivors who will inevitably experience these things, are as follows. And they're nuanced, of course, but these are just some general tropes to understand and to know. So racialized sexual tropes emerged during the slave eras, but have continued to be passed down from generation to generation. Again, those stereotypes, those prejudices that we learn. And we've seen the evolution of some of these tropes actually during different time periods. So the myth of the overbearing matriarch, the mammy, and the Jezebel images all came directly out of slave eras. The matriarch was seen as, of course, overbearing, drove men away, was a workhorse, could reproduce, but wasn't desirable. We then have the mammy, who I always think Shirley Temple era, but was seen as the happy slave, loved to serve, happy with her station in life, basically happy being a slave, and was generally asexual. She was also the one that was tasked with breastfeeding the plantation owner's babies before she was allowed to breastfeed her own. And then we have the Jezebel, who was hypersexualized as compared to the mammy, but hypersexualized, seen as sexually available and indiscriminate. And so whatever sexual violence was enacted upon her body, she deserved it because she was too flirtatious, she was too wanton, she was too out there, she was too promiscuous. There wasn't, again, because of the ways in which Black people were introduced to this country specifically, Black women weren't seen as being rapeable. Black women weren't seen as having the ability to consent or not. We weren't even seen as needing of protection because we weren't seen as virginal, if that makes sense. And then images of the welfare queen, Sapphire, the welfare queen, Sapphire, Black superwomen all came later, closer to the civil rights movement and the war on drugs. The welfare queen was seen as lazy, scamming the system, doesn't want to work, wants to keep having a whole bunch of babies and be a baby making machine. Still, the concept deeply rooted in Black women's ability to say how many children they're going to have or not. But let me not go on a tangent with that. The Sapphire, she is really the neo-Jezebel image. She's seen as loud, angry, exploits men for money. This is where the gold digger trope comes from. And then the Black superwoman, really from this list, the seemingly most positive, the Black superwoman can, will, and wants to do it all on her own. She'll figure it out. She's resilient. She's strong. She'll make it through. Again, seemingly the most positive compared to the others, but still incredibly limiting. And then Black women aren't seen as vulnerable. Black women aren't seen as needing help. Black women aren't seen as, being desperate when we're desperate. And sometimes we are. And so the last one there is the angry, bitter Black woman, which really can be applied to any woman, any Black woman at any time. As smiley and as non-confrontational as I truly am in my daily life, the minute I push back, the minute I critique, I'm seen as angry and bitter. And so to understand that that's the experience for many Black women, generally, that we could exist or we've had to navigate one or multiple of these tropes, like that's a huge weight to bear. And so to understand that it could impact rapport, it could impact service provision, it could impact trust, it could impact someone's willingness to provide information about themselves. Like that's why we have to learn these things. Next slide. So some stats that are specific to Black women and girls that also contextualize the experience a little bit for us include the fact that 41% of Black women have experienced physical violence by an intimate partner during their lifetimes. Between 40 and 60% of Black women report being subjected to coercive sexual contact before the age of 18 or by the age of 18. In the US, 38% or almost 40% of Black women have experienced sexual violence other than rape during their lifetime. 40% of confirmed sex trafficking survivors in the US are Black. And think about that in comparison to our actual population size in the US. But 40% of confirmed sex trafficking survivors are Black. Next slide. And a few more stats, again, just to contextualize the experience. The average age for Black female homicide victims is 5 years younger than the average age for other women. 43% of domestic violence survivors who are arrested along with their abusive partners or as a result of a complaint lodged by their abusive partner were living below the poverty line. 66% were either Black or Latino. And then Black women ages 25 to 29 are 11 times more likely as white women in the same age group to be murdered while pregnant or in the first year after childbirth. Now, all of this being said does not mean that Black men or the Black community is inherently more violent. What it does mean is that when Black women are experiencing violence, we're not able to access resources. We're not able to access services, or the services we do access are not culturally responsive. The advocates or the service providers are not culturally humble. There might be some implicit bias experience there, or folks are introduced to new systems that actually cause them harm. So to understand that all of those things can be true at once, and that Black survivors still need help, and the advocates can do more to support folks, like all of those things are still true. Next slide. And so when it comes to thinking about anti-Blackness, when it comes to thinking about the immigration system, privilege, power, identity, culture, we really have to, again, start piecing together these different puzzle pieces. So let's start with this. And again, fill in the chat. If we were to create the archetype or to draw out what the most normalized person in US society looks like, how would that person show up in society? And I'll give a couple examples why folks drop things in. So things we hear typically, they're male, white, cisgendered, able-bodied, what else? Christian, what else? Oh, so the question was, if we're designing out the archetype of the norm or the most normalized person in our society, what would they look like? So I see English speaking, come from a nuclear family, heterosexual, middle-aged, housing stable, I would say. What else? High income, employed, homeowner, educated. Yeah, college educated, skilled, literate. What else? Might have some generational wealth, cisgendered, yep. Able-bodied, has never been incarcerated, has never used drugs, US citizen or US born, religious, owns a car, owns a home, married, considered neurotypical. I love that comment. If they're a woman, they're seen as wanting or just gonna have bio children. HIV negative, a father, right? And so to think about how slim that category can get, the more you talk through different identities, that's why we really have to lean into talking about privilege or lean into talking about who's considered the norm or not. Because the further, so let me back up actually. So we have those norms. So white, male, middle-aged, owns a car, owns a home, went to college, speaks English generally without an accent, because we know some accents are more acceptable versus others, right? All of those things we just listed out, how are those norms maintained? How do we continue to know that's the normalized person and what happens to everybody else? Through what? Institutions, pop culture, media, music, news anchors, politics, our social codes, right? Who has positions in power? Absolutely. Our literature, visibility of politics, our politicians, the language that's used to describe people, whoever our industry leaders are, absolutely. So those norms are generally maintained through that second ring from the middle, that darker green ring, through sort of the isms, right? Racism, discrimination, ableism, sexism, classism. Those things keep us in line with knowing who's the norm and who's not. And whoever is furthest removed from the norm, the more you're ignored, the more your stories aren't centered, the more the services aren't tailored to you and folks really don't see your need, right? And then also really, again, thinking about those identities and their relationships with systems, that's something we really have to delve into. And I think for us, it's important to really, again, focus in on the immigration system and the relationships with those different identities. So what happens to folks who are furthest removed from being the norm when they have to navigate the legal system, when they have to navigate the immigration system? We've seen things like over-incarceration for Black men. We've seen over-incarceration for Black trans folks. What's happening to Black immigrants in the system? Deportation, absolutely. I know we've seen what's happening to Haitian refugees, but we're not really having those conversations, are we? Detainment, removal proceedings, the impact that colonialism has had, impact that colorism might have on folks, lack of representation, extra scrutiny at every stage of the legal proceeding. What else? Yeah, there's some major differences in treatment and visibility between these different refugee crises, right? And that's not to say that Ukrainian refugees don't deserve everything that they need or everything that they're going to get, but also what's happening to Black refugees, what's happening to Haitian refugees, to others. Thinking about even language access. Do folks have their language access needs met? Because Black folks don't just speak English. And even when we do, we have to think about the impact that things like colonialism, things like discrimination in the school system have had, where not everybody has the same literacy rates even, right? I know I saw something about the way the media portrays folks, Black immigrants, being excluded from legal channels that stabilize their status, normalization of violence in the media. So, that's just normal. That's how their home countries are. These people are just this way, right? Anti-Blackness across many different systems. We see it especially with Afro-Latina, Afro-Caribbean folks. Receiving notices only written in English, right? Again, so back to language access. Next slide. And so all of these thoughts and these themes and threads we're pulling together really are highlighted when we talk about, when we delve into intersectionality. So intersectionality is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, someone great to know, great theorist to know, and is really what she explained as a framework designed to explore the dynamics between identities and what she called connected systems of oppression. So the relationship, for instance, between race, class, and gender, with patriarchy, white supremacy, and capitalism. How are these things connecting? How have they been connected historically? Now, how are things showing up for folks? What is sort of the impact in people's lives? Next slide. And so I love these clips. We're just gonna watch these. I think we have a few more minutes from my time. I'm not trying to slip into Kelly's time too much. But these clips are available on YouTube. They are from Race. They were published and produced by raceforward.org. And they have a really great series that was called Race And so this is, some of these clips are from that series. I definitely recommend folks to just take some time and watch as many as you can, because they're a great exploration of what intersectionality is, of different concepts or themes that some folks really have to think about, what other folks might not because of privilege. And it really explores identity as well. So they're just great clips, highly recommend. We can watch them back to back and then we'll keep going.
Sonia Ginasaka, migrant queer poet, culture organizer. Race and gender, race and immigration status, race and sexuality. Everything and every way that I'm negotiating my space and the way that I'm accessing space is in relation to how the United States of America is seeing me as this brown woman, as this foreign, as this migrant, as this person with an accent, as this person who's perceived femme or woman. I can come up here and identify as a white woman, but that is not the reality. In migrant spaces, we're fighting for immigration rights, getting that DREAM Act or getting that, CIR. Don't talk about, your reproductive rights, or don't talk about your queerness. Doesn't even take into consideration economic class. Doesn't take into consideration how very English-centered it is. How are we fighting for immigration rights and most of your pamphlets are in English? Like, that doesn't make sense. And then in queer spaces, there's been the neglect to acknowledge immigration or even, undocumented status. And then in a general sense, my identity and as an artist and a poet, that is always erased in many spaces. We are always doing reactionary work and we're always doing, fighting against this or fighting against something. But when it comes to artists, we are always left behind. That's one of the reasons many of us burn out, because there's no recognizing all of our identities and showing up as whole beings and showing up as complicated individuals. In this country, what I've noticed is immigration reform has always been about the access to whiteness. Example, we have two borders. Which border is racialized? Which border is more militarized? Which border exists within racial coded language? That's usually the Mexican border, right? And there's this dismiss of that there's a border right with Canada. Many movements that are advocating for undocumented communities, they're always leaving out Black migrants. Look at all the campaigns, look at even the posters. There's one sort of depiction of immigration and migrants that is very coded under who is now deemed acceptable to kind of uplift white supremacy or whiteness or a certain identity of citizenship in this country. So, and that's many brown communities. There's the reason why there's anti-blackness within migrant spaces and non-Black people of color spaces. There's always going to be a policy that is going to be shifted, but at the core of it, non-white bodies are always going to be seen as quote-unquote illegal, or as not having any legality in this country. All of my identities are intertwined. I think that having to negotiate with any of them is not going to take us anywhere to the journey of liberation or radicalness or progressiveness that we are actually trying to do. If anything, is the erasure of what has led us here. I'm I'm Jamia Wilson, Executive Director of Women, Action, and the Media. Race and gender. Race and disability. Race and class. Intersectionality is something that I think about every day because I'm living it. And I also think about what it means to show up in the world in my specific body with my specific experience and background. I am African American. I'm also straight. I am able-bodied except for the fact that I was born with a visual impairment, so I walk around with a disability that sometimes people can't see. I was raised in an upper middle class background, so I have class privilege. All of those things play into power, privilege, and marginalization that I experience depending on those different aspects of my identity. Even though race is a social construct and we know that genetically there is no such thing as race, it's this very powerful, powerful illusion that's been perpetuated and used to kill people. It's been used to justify war. It's been used to enslave people. It's been used to force people into indentured servitude. And to disregard that history is disrespectful to all the people who suffered and fought for me to be able to live closer to freedom today. When I am in feminist spaces, and sometimes I might be told that it's divisive for me to bring up race, that we need to focus on the issue at hand, which is gender. Or it might come up in a space where we're doing racial justice work, and I might be told by another person of color, well, this isn't an issue about your gender, this isn't an issue about race, and it doesn't matter what the gender issue is, race has to take priority and precedence in this issue. That's impossible for me to make a prioritization of various parts of my identity that are equally integral to who I am and that are inextricably connected. We want to make sure that we're not single-storying other people and that we aren't contributing to that people need to be able to show up as their whole selves, and that's better for us as a community and as a culture and a society. What I really want to ask people who ask me that question is, what part of your own internalized oppression or your own addiction to the drug that is privilege makes you fear full liberation for all people? There's a problem with even seeing this as divisive. There's a problem when we're not actually understanding that the liberation of all people makes us all free. When trans women of color are free, that's bringing me close to freedom. When Syrian refugees are free, that brings me close to freedom. It's really important for us to think about that, not to think about how we protect our own privilege with a structure that doesn't even work for us, but how do we create more openness and liberation for all human beings, for all humanity.
Lady Dane Figueroa Aditi, performance artist, goddess, ancient jazz priestess of Mother Africa. Race and gender. Race and class. So I'm a Black, Indigenous, Cuban, Nigerian, American woman who's trans. I'm the daughter of an immigrant. I come from the ghettos of Baltimore. People have to understand what all of the histories of all of those identities in order to understand really my positionality within the world. There are poor Black people, there are rich Black people, there are Black cis women, there are Black trans women. And so intersectionality is telling us that we have to discuss race in particular, right? Like, because that's the topic that I'm using. Like, if we're talking about race, that we have to talk about it in its full scope. Yes, we are sharing an experience because, for example, two Black people, we are sharing this experience because we're both Black. But I'm a Black trans woman, and so numbers don't lie, and we all know that Black trans women in particular are some of the most marginalized in our community and the most affected by structural oppression. There's this concept that we are all given the same opportunities, but it's not true. If we look historically and we talk about, this idea of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, Black people actually did pull themselves up by their bootstraps. But we then have places like Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. There was thriving Black neighborhoods, Black people buying from Black businesses, owning Black businesses, investing in Black businesses. Right, and that's what they're told. All you have to do is be rich and nobody can ever hurt you again. All you have to do is buy into the system and move upward and you'll be safe. What then happened was their white neighbors would then come and literally commit acts of genocide. And so now today, right, we have people who could have had old money who are now poor. And so what is that psychologically saying to these people? That when you thrive, when you succeed, you're still not safe. And so we're talking about race and class, and we're not understanding the history of race and class as it presents itself in America in particular, because that's where we're living, right? And we're having a fool's conversation. If someone comes to me and they say to me, you are creating differences, I would say, no, that's actually not true. Because in my indigenous cultures, people who were different were still essential to society. Within European cultures, particularly within the rise of patriarchy and the way that it manifests through religion, is that differences, little by little, were no longer celebrated and they were stamped out. And the one thing that structural oppression gives us, that we should all aspire to, generally is of a cis, het, white man. So when we're talking about intersectionality, right, I'm always being an intersectional being because I'm all of these things always at once. If you're having a conversation with me and you're not having a conversation understanding that I come with all of those identities within the conversation, then how are we supposed to move forward?
Thank you. So I love all of those clips. Again, highly recommend folks to just take some time and watch as many as you can. But really, the importance is to understand, those different layers of identity. Understand that the experience of an Afro-Colombian woman from rural Colombia is going to be different from the experience of a Black American trans woman from Baltimore, right? So to understand not only the identity experience, but also the impact that any type of border crossing may have had on folks, any type of generational trauma may have had on folks. The names, so it's from the Race and series. And you can just type in hashtag race and on YouTube. And yes, they were published by raceforward.org. Next slide. So also with thinking about the intersectionality, thinking about intersections of identity, we also have to understand where there might be increased vulnerabilities as well and the impact that can have on someone's experience with trauma. So we've seen in the Black community, multi-generational trauma together with continued oppression and in the absence for opportunities to heal or access benefits available in society have resulted for many, or for some at least, post-traumatic slave syndrome. I'm not going to go into that too much, but it's a really interesting concept that explores how trauma is passed down generation to generation between families, and especially when you're experiencing polyvictimization or those multiple layers of trauma. So again, what happens to folks as they're experiencing poverty, as they're navigating health disparities, as they have limited mental health access or educational opportunities, as they're being forced into or introduced into the criminal legal system. And then on top of that, what happens as they're navigating the immigration system as well? What does access look like for folks? Next slide. And I love this. It's always a great reminder when talking about or describing barriers, but use caution when describing barriers. Being Black is not a barrier for me. White supremacy is the barrier. Being female is not a barrier for me. Patriarchy is the barrier. Name the systems of power. Those are the barriers, not the identities. Next slide. And I think it's really important. Again, we all go into this work with best intentions, but we still have power in the positions that we're in comparison to the survivors that we serve. So although we go into domestic violence work or trafficking work or immigration work with best intentions, we still operate from a place of privilege and power when working with survivors. The power dynamics that come with being deemed an authority is something to pay attention to. You cannot exert power and expect to empower. Next slide. And with that, just closing out, also really want folks to tap into or to really lean into our understandings around or gain some more understandings or insight around microaggressions. Microaggressions have been defined as brief and commonplace, typically daily, verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that oftentimes communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative slights or insults to a target person or group. Next slide. And microaggressions typically show up in one of these three ways. So microassaults, which are usually more conscious and intentional actions or slurs, such as using racist language or displaying swastikas or nooses, really what's thought of as like old school racism, right? My example of microassaults, which I grew up with in high school, for example, I went to a predominantly white high school. There were very few Black people, or very few people of color, and even fewer Black people. But a microassault we would experience every now and then was that every now and then some student or group of students would go around the school hanging nooses. It was really just a subtle way to remind you that, hey, you're the minority here. Hey, you're going to still be the minority, and that there are power plays at work, right? Micro insults could be daily, could be verbal and nonverbal communications that subtly convey rudeness or insensitivity and demean a person's racial heritage or identity. Something that many Black girls, especially dark-skinned Black girls, have grown up hearing is that, oh, you're pretty for a dark-skinned girl. Many Afro-Latinos will also speak to this fact of, oh, don't get too dark. Oh, don't be too dark. Again, thinking about the way that anti-Blackness might show up, even from our own communities. And then micro-invalidations, communications that subtly exclude, negate, or nullify the thoughts, feelings, or experiential reality of someone who has been marginalized. So we've seen it with survivors generally, of people saying, well, if it was that bad, why didn't you leave? Or it couldn't have been that bad, or whatever. We've also seen it when it comes to race. So if a survivor comes up to you, immigrant survivor comes up to you and says, I think I just experienced something really racist by this person. You're like, well, I've known that person for a long time. We sort of started to explain away their experience. We're really just negating or nullifying that experience and not really listening and investing in what they're saying. So really try to check in when these things show up, call it out if you need to when these things show up, and do a lot to reframe narratives so that these microaggressions and that implicit bias isn't going to show up in our work in the same way that it has historically. Next slide. Oh, body shame. I could go on a whole tangent about that. Body shaming, you're pretty for a big girl, fat oppression. Yes, there's the thin privilege. There's a whole bunch that can go into that, right? And just generally with microaggressions, again, thinking about privilege, thinking about hair politics as well, thinking about privilege, thinking about identity, culture, what's considered the norm or not. So some general principles that I think are helpful when applying anti-oppression to our work, and especially within your program or within your system, to make sure to avoid tokenism and correct it when it shows up. I worked at a program where my supervisor was saying, I'm so glad you're here because you really know how to work with the Black survivors. And I was like, well, what happens when I leave? Who's going to do it? You should get to know how to talk to folks, right? White allies, we need you to step up when other white allies need to be held accountable. Do not put all of the onus on Black advocates, on Black immigration attorneys, on other people of color attorneys to step up. Sometimes we need white allies to really focus in on each other. Silence for many equals violence, because if you're not speaking out or speaking up or pushing back against something, a lot of times folks will think you're complicit in it. It's really important that, especially as you're doing equity work, as you're doing diversity and inclusion work, that we're making sure to not tone police Black women, whether it's the survivor that you're working with or the advocate that you're in space with, to really let folks show up as their true selves, to let folks get across their points as they need to get across their points, and then really to make sure that if the tone is something you don't appreciate, to maybe unpack why that is, or really unpack what the root of your discomfort is. Apply trauma-informed principles when working with staff as well. You can't just think, hey, we're gonna do it for survivors, and you're not treating your staff well as either. Examine language and the histories behind language, really to understand, again, that language is fluid, it's changed. What might have been acceptable might no longer be acceptable, right? Like we used to say colored people, we don't say that anymore. We say people of color, so person first language even. Set some goals and remain thoughtful about the follow-up. Don't fall into fragility, and when you do, process it and keep going. Feeling fragile in the work is one of those major distractions from actually doing deep-rooted equity work. Remember that healing is a process. It's a learning and unlearning process. There are going to be a lot of speed bumps in the way, but that doesn't mean you need to stop the learning or stop the growth. Remember to create spaces for these conversations, and very intentional spaces for these conversations. Like set out time, schedule it, make sure that people are picking back up on these things. Continue to reevaluate if those spaces feel safe and brave. So an example of fragility that I would give, I'm just going to give an example from a really great friend of mine who's a white ally in the work, who is really invested in this work and has not always been perfect, which I don't expect her to be, because she's not going to have my same lived experience because she's not a Black woman, right? But she's still invested in the work. So we've had a conversation. We had a conversation, for instance, where she felt like she was trying to get these great points across, but she wasn't being supported by myself or other people of color in the work, even though she was advocating for us. We had to have a very frank conversation to say, well, we have different levels of privilege, even within this organization, where I really have to worry about being fired if I say the same thing that you're saying. So to not take it personally, to not let it stop you from doing the work, but to, again, change that narrative and not let that fragility or those emotional moments even keep us from doing the work. Even if you make a mistake and you have to say, I'm really sorry that I hurt you in this space, or I'm really sorry that I made you uncomfortable in this space. Don't let that stop you from the momentum that you've gained. So I hope that sort of answers the question. Remember to embrace confrontation. Now, by this, I do not mean go yell at each other in the middle of the hallway, but what I do mean is be willing to have uncomfortable conversations. Be willing to sit in space and just process together. Be willing to call out things when they need to be called out as well. And then, of course, change policies and practices whenever applicable. The status quo won't change if we're not doing some deep dives into what has existed and what is currently still in place. There are certain policies that might be rooted in microaggression even, right? So some folks mentioned hair politics. So some folks mentioned hair politics and the fact that in certain workspaces in 2022, I, with my locked hair, could be fired from certain jobs, or may experience microaggressions where folks are saying, oh, your hair is pretty for having locks, or oh, your hair is nice. Like just certain things that might come up, or it even being rooted in your policies. So standards around professionalism and what that means, or standards around dress code. Take a look at those things. And I did see a question come up. The question came up, this may be around semantics, but why would things be listed as microaggressions be considered, microaggressions? They seem pretty direct aggression to me. So I agree that many of the microaggressions that folks might experience do come off as very aggressive, but they're not always intended to be. And so I think that's probably why folks more so say microaggression versus like outright racism, because it might be rooted in more so a lack of awareness or a lack of visibility or a lack of experience more so than negative connotations, if that makes sense. And I didn't see any other questions like that come up, but if folks do have other questions, feel free to drop it in the Q&A box or in the chat, or feel free to send me an email. I'm going to put I know it's in the slide, but I'll put my email in there as well. I think that's next slide. I think that's all the time I have. Okay, yes. So my email is here. My email's here, and then our info box as well. Feel free to reach out to me if you have other questions or just want to follow up on this conversation. But Kelly is going to, again, add to a lot of this context and help us unpack a little bit more what anti-Blackness looks like, how it impacts Black immigrant survivors. And so I'm going to pass it over to Kelly.
Thank you so much, Ayana, for that presentation. That was really great and very helpful information. In my presentation, I'm going to be referring to a lot of different sources. I'll give a lot of different author names. The slides have the name of the author who is connected to that point. So you can use the name to refer to the source in the Works Cited page that was distributed to you as part of the materials for the webinar. So all the sources will either be listed there, or I will mention in the presentation who stated that point. So next slide, please. We're going to start with a poll just to test your knowledge. There was a report by the Black Alliance for Just Immigration on Black immigrant women and femmes. And in that report, what percentage of respondents stated that they experienced sexual harassment, sexual assault, or both? Okay, we can go ahead and close the poll. So the answer to that question, which most of you got right, was more than 65%. And that is a pretty staggering number, right? So if this survey is at all representative of the Black immigrant women and femme community, it goes to show that gender-based violence is most likely a very common experience among members of this community. Next slide, please. So at the beginning of the presentation, I wanted to talk about some concrete and contemporary examples of anti-Blackness in the immigration system. Next slide, please. So this topic could have a multi-day webinar. Just for interest of time, I'm going to focus on a few examples. The first of these are remarks by the former president. As some of you may know, back in January of 2018, he had questioned why the United States should accept more immigrants from Haiti and from African countries. He used an expletive to refer to these countries, which I will not repeat here. The Associated Press, when they wrote about this, they characterized his statements as a contemptuous description of an entire continent. And this was just an example of anti-Blackness in the system that came from the very top of the executive branch. So it was very troubling. The second topic is treatment of Cameroonian asylum seekers. So there were asylum seekers from Cameroon, which is an African country that Human Rights Watch said has deteriorating respect for human rights and mass displacement. These asylum seekers were both abused in US immigration custody and then deported to Cameroon, where they experienced persecution, including gender-based violence by government security forces. And when they were in US immigration custody, some of the mistreatment included being threatened, injured, pepper sprayed, subjected to forced fingerprinting on immigration documents, and being subjected to use of force, such as strangulation. In one case, there was a knee placed on a person's neck. And the source for this information is there was a report by Human Rights Watch about this topic in February of this year that was included in the work cited in your materials. There was also an article from the Guardian newspaper dated October 22nd of 2020 by Julian Borger that's about this, as well as two individuals, Sophia Cassini and Luz Virginia Lopez, had submitted a complaint to the Department of Homeland Security Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties in October 7th of 2020 about this topic. The next is the treatment of Haitian non-citizens at the US-Mexico border. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with those very horrific images that came out in September of last year that were of Border Patrol agents using horses and reins against Haitian non-citizens at the border. There was a letter that was written by Congresswoman Cori Bush, Senator Cory Booker, and some other individuals to President Biden, who had said that this incident highlighted longstanding concerns regarding the disparate treatment of Black migrants by immigration enforcement officials. The next topic is unheeded requests for temporary protected status for African countries. For those of you who aren't familiar, temporary protected status is for individuals who are from countries that have temporary conditions that make it so the folks are not able to return to those countries. That might include armed conflict or an epidemic. One of those countries is Haiti, or is Mauritania and Ethiopia. So various organizations had sent very well cited letters to the administration requesting TPS for these countries, and those requests were not heeded, despite the lots of information about country conditions that would support those designations. One country that was mentioned in this presentation, because at the time it had not been designated, is Cameroon. On April 15th, Secretary Mayorkas did designate Cameroon for TPS, so that was a positive development. And as the organization Undocu-Black Network said about the double standard in the TPS designations, they said that the quick designation of TPS for Ukraine compared to the years-long campaigns that were needed for past designations, and the few and far between designations for Black majority countries, show the structural racism that exists at all levels of the US immigration system. And that goes back to what Ayana was talking about with the double standards of Ukrainian refugees versus refugees from African countries. The next topic is Title 42, which, for those of you who aren't familiar with Title 42, that is a public health law that has been used to justify expelling folks from the southwest border without allowing them to apply for asylum. Secretary Mayorkas said that this policy will end next month, but in the meantime, he highlighted that folks will still be expelled from the southwest border if they are attempting to enter without permission. And this policy has been very harmful, in particular to Haitian migrants. Human Rights Watch emphasized that the United States has expelled more than 20,000 people from Haiti since January 1st of last year. And then there was a letter to the administration that also highlighted the disproportionate impact that Title 42 is having on Black migrants from Haiti. The next topic are racial disparities in the system. So the first is length of detention. There was an article by Jack Herrera where he mentioned that the two countries that had folks with the longest period of ICE detention were Rwanda and Kenya. So he mentioned that the person who was in ICE detention the longest, which was for 10 years, was from Rwanda. And the person who was in detention for the second most number of years, Kenya, was from Kenya. And that just goes to show that there's the disproportionate length of detention for people to the extent that country of origin can be used as a proxy for race. The next statistic is solitary confinement. There was a study that came out in 2020 about solitary confinement in the immigration detention system. The data is a little bit old. It was from 2013 to 2017, but I still think it's pretty eye-opening. That study showed that about 24% of solitary confinement cases in immigration detention were of folks from Africa and the Caribbean. And that is despite the fact that those individuals were less than 4% of the detained population. So you're just seeing that there's a huge disproportionate amount of folks from African and Caribbean countries. And that shows that, again, to the extent that country of origin is a proxy for race, that folks who are Black in immigration detention are being subjected to solitary confinement at rates that are far beyond their percentage of the detained population. And then finally, Carla McCanders noted in an article that in 2017, nationals of Somalia, which is a country in Africa, had the highest rate of removal. So again, it's showing the disproportionate impacts, negative impacts of the immigration system on Black people. Next slide, please. Now we're going to talk about anti-Blackness in the criminal legal system, and we'll see later on why this is important in immigration presentation. Next slide, please. So the first topic I want to talk about are racial disparities in arrest rates. Black people were almost 26% of those who were arrested in 2020, and that is more than double their share of the population in that year. So you're seeing already that there's disproportionate rates of arrest of Black folks compared to their percentage in the population. Regarding imprisonment rates of Black women in particular, the NAACP found that the imprisonment rate for African-American women is twice that of white women. And regarding marijuana arrests, there was a report from 2020 that looked at arrests from 2010 to 2018, and that found that Black people are almost 4 times more likely than white people to be arrested for marijuana possession. And that is despite the fact that, according to the report, the usage rates were relatively similar between the two populations. And finally, with drug arrest rates, in 2019, Black adults were 27% of drug arrests, even though they were only about 12% of the US adult population at that time. So you're seeing that in terms of the criminal legal system, there are these disparities in general arrest rates, imprisonment rates, and marijuana and drug arrest rates of Black people, especially when you consider their percentage of the population and their rates and percentage of arrests for these different categories. Next slide, please. And now we're going to dive deeper into anti-Blackness in the criminal legal system and how it specifically impacts Black female identified people who are survivors of domestic violence. So I am focusing on female identified people today because according to the CDC, women are disproportionately affected by intimate partner and sexual violence. But we do, of course, recognize that folks who are non-binary and men can also be survivors of intimate partner and sexual violence. I also wanted to ground the remaining discussion in this concept, the fact that a female identified person is in the criminal legal system, that's not incompatible with her being a survivor of gender-based violence. And that is highlighted by the author Callie Nicole Gross had highlighted that the author Beth Ritchie stated in her book, Arrested Justice, that 68% of incarcerated Black women had been victimized by intimate partner violence. So that's a staggering statistic, and it just drives home the fact that being a survivor of violence and being in the criminal legal system are not mutually exclusive. And now that we have this basic background, we're going to discuss anti-Blackness in the system in the context of Black female survivors. So the first topic that I wanted to talk about here is the impact of mandatory and pro-arrest policies on Black female survivors. So the author, Carolyn West, in a 2007 piece, had noted that mandatory arrest laws have led to more Black women being arrested. And just to give folks some context as to what is mandatory arrest, the author Rhea Shinde noted that as part of the Violence Against Women Act, there were grants that incentivized police departments to create either mandatory or pro-arrest policies for domestic violence offenses. But the research has shown that these policies have actually led to more Black women being arrested. West gave the example of Maryland. She said that before the pro-arrest legislation there was expanded, 18% of white women had been detained before that, and then 25% after. But then when she looked at Black women, she noticed that 25% of Black women had been detained before, and then that went up to 38% who were detained after that law was implemented. So you're seeing that there was already a racial disparity in the detentions before the mandatory arrest law, but then you saw that after, the rate of increase was much higher for Black women than for white women. And when we're talking about who is being arrested in these circumstances, West noted that a substantial amount of the female arrestees, in some samples up to 60%, are actually battered women who had used aggression in the context of ongoing abuse perpetrated against them by their male partners. So when we're talking about these Black women who are being arrested more frequently because of these policies, and many times they are actually battered women who are being arrested. The second topic are these stereotypes about Black women. Ayana gave a really good presentation about these stereotypes and how harmful they've been. West focused in particular on this social construction of the strong Black woman. She had said that this construction is incongruent with the preferred traditional profile of the battered woman as passive, frightened, and helplessly trapped in an abusive relationship. And she had said that Black women who use active resistance may receive limited understanding, support, or assistance from others, including the criminal justice system. And the author, Michelle Jacobs, had focused in her writing about this stereotype of Black women as liars. And she said that this harmful stereotype continued after emancipation. And she had quoted some other scholars in her work, Yarbrough and Bennett. And these scholars stated that the African-American woman's racial and gender identity makes her particularly susceptible to being disbelieved. And Jacobs had highlighted that Yarbrough and Bennett gave the examples of some prominent Black female survivors of gender-based violence, for example, Anita Hill and Desiree Washington. And Jacobs highlighted that these Black women's truthfulness was openly contested, despite the fact that they all testified under oath. So that just goes to show that this harmful stereotype that Black women can't be believed has continued to this day to negatively impact survivors of gender-based violence. And Jacobs also argues that in contemporary times, judges still view Black women as aggressive and prone to violence. And she also highlighted that Black women are less likely to be seen as victims by the police and more likely to be seen as aggressors. And she said that this increases the likelihood that Black women will be arrested more frequently, even if they are the ones who call the police for help. Next slide, please. So now that we've talked about the anti-Blackness in the criminal legal system and how it specifically affects Black women who are survivors of domestic violence, Why, for example, would a Black female immigrant survivor be in the criminal legal system? So there are a lot of reasons. The first, this generalized anti-Blackness that we've talked about in the system, independent of survivor-based anti-Blackness, that can very well affect Black immigrant survivors and increase their chances of being entangled in the criminal legal system. The next are these harmful stereotypes about Black women that affect Black women who are survivors of domestic violence. They can very well also impact Black immigrant women who are survivors and make it more likely that they are entangled in the system, even though they are, in fact, the victims in the situation. For example, a Black female immigrant survivor of domestic violence who is arrested for defending herself, she might be viewed less sympathetically by a judge, or she may be less likely to be believed that she is the aggressor because the system actor subscribes to this harmful stereotype that she is more likely to be the aggressor because of her race. And similarly, due to this harmful stereotype that's persisted over generations that Black women are liars, system actors might be less likely to believe that a Black female immigrant is the victim in the situation, even if she tries to assert that, for example, to the police, to the prosecutor. And that might make it more likely both that she enters the system at the point of arrest in that initial contact with the police, and that she continues in the system through to conviction and sentencing, despite the fact that she is the victim in the relationship. Similarly, like all survivors, Black immigrant survivors might be compelled to engage in criminal activity. The author Mary Jilfus had noted that victims may be coerced into crimes by abusive partners. She also emphasized the fact that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, that abuse can force women into poverty and homelessness. And then she also highlighted the fact that economic abuse exists. So if you think about it, the fact that a Black immigrant woman is a survivor of domestic violence and is either compelled to commit crimes by her abusive partner, or she is impoverished by the violence and feels compelled to commit crimes to support herself and her children, those pre-existing disparities in arrest rates on top of that issue of being compelled to engage in crime might make it particularly likely that she will be entangled in the system. And immigration status could make these survivors even more vulnerable, because in some cases they might lack work authorization. And if they don't have work authorization, they're either unable to work or they're compelled to engage in a low-wage job where they're subjected to exploitation due to that power imbalance between the employer and a person without work authorization. And if she's in the situation where she's a survivor of violence and she's been impoverished by that, she might feel even more compelled to feel that her only option for supporting herself and her children is to engage, for example, in petty crime. And you see the pre-existing racial disparities on top of that. You see how it could occur that she could get entangled in the system. Some abusers also use arrest itself as a tool of power and control. That's something that Jilfus had highlighted, and West had also highlighted that, and she used a term called the phone first strategy, and she was mentioning that some perpetrators manipulate the criminal justice system and then set the stage for a retaliatory arrest against a victim defendant after the abuser files, for example, a false complaint. And if you think about it, this tool can be a particularly devastating tool of power and control for a Black immigrant survivor in particular, for two reasons, both because of the generally negative immigration consequences that are associated with an arrest or conviction, coupled with those harmful stereotypes about Black women that might make it less likely that this particular survivor is believed by system actors. So you see there that immigration status is an additional layer of vulnerability that may make it even more likely that a survivor is subjected to the use of arrest as a tool of power and control. And then finally, there's the issue of trauma, coping strategies, and lack of support. So you see this quotation on the slide. That was from a Black immigrant participant in a study by the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, and that really highlights the difficulty of finding quality mental health services. The researchers Ting and Sabri have identified something that I'm sure most of you already know, that post-traumatic stress disorder is linked with intimate partner violence. And knowing this, also consider the finding by a researcher in 2016 who found that there is actually an association between trauma and increased likelihood of arrest and incarceration among Black Americans in particular. And then on top of that, consider that victims generally may use alcohol or drugs, for example, to self-medicate due to the trauma that they're suffering from the abuse. So when you consider how all of these things layer on top of each other, the link between intimate partner violence and PTSD, the association between trauma and criminal legal system involvement among Black Americans, like the trauma causing them to be involved in the system. Some survivors' use of drug and alcohol to self-medicate, and those disproportionate drug arrests that we talked about before, as applied to Black folks, it's particularly troubling that the participants in that 2020 study had identified multiple barriers to therapy, including cost, lack of insurance coverage, and cultural stigma. So you're seeing that all of these forms of oppression are layering on top of each other. And the barriers to therapy highlight the lack of support and mental health resources that Black immigrant survivors of domestic violence might face. So when you consider all of these forms of oppression that are intersecting and layering on top of one another, you see that it might be particularly likely that a survivor could end up in the criminal legal system with all of the collateral consequences that flow from involvement in that system for people who are not US citizens. So with that, we'll transition to the next slide and talk about the intersection between the criminal, legal, and immigration systems. Next slide, please. So this slide is just, it's not meant to be a primer on the immigration consequences of criminal convictions. That also could be a multi-day webinar. This is just meant to show folks in just how many places the criminal, legal, and immigration systems intersect with each other, and all of the ways that contact with the criminal legal system can have a negative impact on a non-citizen's ability to stay in the United States or obtain legal status. So criminal histories can have multiple negative impacts for non-citizens. The negative impacts apply to undocumented people, people who do have non-immigrant status. An example of that would be a U visa, and even lawful permanent residents, such as green card holders, can be impacted by having a criminal history. As well, when it comes time for people to apply for naturalization or citizenship, they need to show good moral character. So in that case, a criminal history can also be a roadblock. You see here that a criminal history can be a ground of inadmissibility. Inadmissibility, for those who are not familiar, generally applies to people who are seeking admission to the United States. So in the survivor-based categories, the people who would be subject to inadmissibility include people applying for U visas, T visas, application for adjustment of status, also known as a green card, based on, for example, an approved Violence Against Women Act self-petition. All of these people are subject to these grounds of inadmissibility and could find that a criminal record can prevent or make it more difficult to obtain lawful immigration status. On the other hand, grounds of deportability, they apply to people who have already been admitted to the United States. So for example, a person who is here on a student visa or someone who actually has their green card, they can still be subjected to these grounds listed here of deportability. And having a criminal history can possibly lead to their deportation from the United States. You see here domestic violence offenses. If you're thinking about, those stereotypes that we talked about that could lead to a Black woman being arrested for domestic violence, even though she is the victim in the situation. You could see how that could cause a problem for her immigration status. Aggravated felony, despite the name of it in the law, it does not have to be aggravated or a felony, depending on the jurisdiction. For example, shoplifting could be considered an aggravated felony. So you're seeing here how the criminal legal system really does intersect with the immigration system. And then there's also the issue of discretionary analysis. So even if, say, for example, someone was just arrested and they were never convicted of a crime, so there's no inadmissibility or deportability issue, the immigration officer can still look at all of the positive and negative factors in the case, and they could deny the case based, just on that arrest. And in a lot of survivor-based cases, discretionary analysis does come up. It comes up in U visa cases when people are seeking a waiver of an admissibility. That's basically forgiveness. So for example, say a survivor entered the US without permission, so she needs a waiver of that inadmissibility, but she has an arrest on her record for defending herself against domestic violence, and she may very well have gotten that record because of these anti-Black stereotypes that Black female survivors have faced. She might not be able to get that U visa because of that arrest. And there's nothing in the Immigration and Nationality Act that says these grounds don't apply if there's a connection, generally, if there's a connection to the abuse because of anti-Blackness in the criminal legal system, if it's because of these stereotypes against Black women that led to this Black female survivor being arrested, or that combination that we talked about before of trauma, anti-Blackness, coerced crime, and the lack of mental health support that could have led to a survivor, for example, getting a drug conviction. And the immigration system's uncritical consideration of these criminal records that may very well be the product of an anti-Black system that harms Black female survivors in particular, that is an additional example of anti-Blackness in the immigration system. And that anti-Blackness impacts, in particular, Black immigrant survivors, because it could lead them to lose access to victim protections that Congress specifically designed for them. And this outcome compromises their safety and their autonomy. So in this way, the immigration system itself, by just considering these crimes without considering the context in which these records were obtained, it perpetuates that cycle of anti-Blackness for Black female identified immigrant survivors. Next slide, please. And now we're going to talk a little bit more about anti-Blackness and immigrant survivors. Next slide. So in addition to all of those forms of anti-Blackness that we already discussed, Black immigrant survivors, they also face erasure, exclusion, and hierarchies. So we'll start with hierarchies. Bell Hooks stated in 1981 that as far back as slavery, white people established a social hierarchy based on race and sex that ranked white men first, white women second, though sometimes equal to Black men, who are ranked third, and Black women last. So in addition to all of these other forms of oppression that we've identified, Black female identified immigrant survivors have to deal with, they also have to deal with this hierarchy where Black women are placed at the very bottom, as Bell Hooks identified. There's also Kimberly Crenshaw's idea of intersectionality and exclusion, which Ayana had talked about. Crenshaw had argued that Black women are sometimes excluded from both feminist theory and anti-racist policy discourse, because both of those things often do not accurately reflect, as she said, the interaction of race and gender. And you could see that in some of the videos that Ayana had showed. That Black women are, sometimes excluded from both of these spaces because there's either the focus on just gender or the focus on just race without considering both of those things. So Black immigrant survivors have to also deal with that exclusion that Crenshaw has highlighted. And then you also see on the slide these quotes about Black immigrants, and in particular Black immigrant women being erased and invisible from immigration discourse, which was also highlighted in some of the videos that Ayana showed. So this first quote was from a participant in the Black Alliance for Just Immigration study. And she said that that this invisibility makes their mistreatment even more horrific, as it means that their stories are rarely supported and justice is rarely served. And then Nasraddin in 2017 in her undergraduate thesis had said that the intersectional identities of Black immigrant women as Black, foreign, and woman render them essentially invisible in US immigration discourse and especially vulnerable to intimate partner violence due to these multifaceted layers of oppression, as well as specific cultural and religious implications. So when you're applying Crenshaw's intersectional framework, we see that not only must a Black immigrant survivor, does she have to contend with general anti-Black racism, she has to contend with these stereotypes about Black women and what that means for her as a Black female identified survivor of domestic violence. She needs to contend with the safety concerns that all survivors of domestic violence have. She has to contend with these exclusion and hierarchies that Crenshaw and Hooks have identified. She has to contend with this erasure from immigration discourse. She has to contend with the general anti-immigrant discourse in our society and among some members of our government, and fears about her immigration status, what it means to be undocumented, what it means to be a non-citizen. And when you consider all of these intersecting identities and forms of oppression, rather than just using what Crenshaw had called the single axis framework of just considering one identity, you see that female identified Black immigrants who are survivors of domestic violence are uniquely burdened. And so what is the role of attorneys, advocates, and service providers in light of this anti-Blackness? So for those who are not already members of the impacted community, it's important to get educated as much as possible on the vulnerabilities and the forms of oppression that survivors are subjected to, attending webinars like the one Ayana put on today. It's important to be willing to learn from the communities themselves that are most impacted, increasing the visibility of Black immigrant, female identified survivors, Black girl survivors, and including their voices in our organization's campaigns to eradicate patriarchy, oppression, domestic violence, because a strategic plan, for example, that does not incorporate these voices is not truly inclusive. We need to be considering the effects of trauma, for example, before denying or ceasing services to a survivor who may be perceived as difficult, particularly in light of the barriers to mental health support, for example, that we identified earlier. We need to be aware of all of our own biases and work on countering them as much as possible. We need to consider the role of anti-Blackness when we see that a survivor, for example, has a criminal record. And rather than reflexively turning away survivors who maybe on paper might appear to be a perpetrator of domestic violence without considering how anti-Blackness and those stereotypes, for example, could have led to a battered woman obtaining a criminal record. And most importantly, we need to be honoring and respecting a survivor's choices, even if that choice means that she does not want to involve law enforcement in her case. Next slide, please. So this hypothetical here is, it is a hypothetical, but it does reflect writing on lots of different topics, on intimate partner violence against Black immigrant women, on the criminal legal system experiences of Black female survivors of intimate partner violence, as well as the experiences of Black immigrant women who had sought medical treatment, and then general racism in the medical system. So I'll give folks a few minutes to read through this. And then this is meant to be a discussion question, so please feel free to put your thoughts in the chat, and I look forward to talking about this. Right. So please feel free to keep putting your suggestions in the chat, but everyone who's responded so far have really great insights. Right. Black women being seen as more aggressive by police, by system actors, Black women's pain being more likely to be dismissed and not believed. Some of the participants in the BAJI study had noted that they were silenced and ignored in doctors' offices. And then there was a study from 2016 that found that half of white medical residents and medical students held these false beliefs about biological differences between Black and white people, and then that those same people rated Black people's pain is lower and made these less accurate treatment recommendations. So you're seeing there how anti-Blackness could have led to the issues in the doctor's office. This stereotype of Black women as liars who can't be believed, that might have led to, for example, the police officer not believing her when she said that she was the victim in the situation. There's and that highlights the experiences of, for example, Anita Hill and Desiree Washington, who even testified under oath, but they were still disbelieved. She may have felt forced to plead guilty. If, there were all these system actors who weren't believing her, you'd want to talk to her about that. Basically, what would be important here for the attorney is working with her to be able basically to show her good moral character. And this is where having a culturally competent advocate would be really helpful, working with her to get her story, providing her with referrals and support, helping her find ways to show that she is a person of good character. The attorney in the cover letter or brief might want to incorporate some of this literature about stereotypes against Black women that may lead to Black female survivors being arrested. Some of this literature on pro-arrest policies, for example, as well as general literature on racial disparities in the criminal legal system, and needing to recognize the multiple forms of anti-Blackness that could be a barrier to this particular survivor getting immigration-based relief, and doing everything that we can to help her get that relief. Showing her positives, right, Suzanne, that's great. Painting the picture that this one arrest should not prevent her from getting her immigration relief, right? Recognizing that minimization is a common response. Exactly, that showed up in the literature. So not discounting that she's a survivor of violence because of this minimization. Anti-Blackness as an obstacle and not exercising discretion, right? Exactly, painting her as an aggressor and not a survivor. I like the idea of seeing a healthcare professional that's a partner and understands strangulation and IPV. I think that's great. Trying to connect her with a culturally competent therapist, that's also very important. And that's where culturally competent advocates can be particularly helpful. And service providers can listen non-judgmentally, affirm this person as a survivor, even if every other actor didn't believe her, even if the police, the prosecutor, the judge, the doctor, you can be that person who believes her. Be understanding cultural beliefs, stigma around using mental health services, for example, understanding how these multiple forms of oppression are impacting her life, not judging her approach to using services, because there has been some literature about how in some communities people understandably first try to work with family or with members of the community before going to outside organizations, not immediately denying her services because she has an arrest on her record, which might at first glance make it appear like she's a perpetrator of domestic violence, and then recognizing the unique safety concerns that she has as a Black woman who is an immigrant and a survivor of domestic violence. Right. Well, thank you, everyone, for your thoughts on that. I thought that was really great. Ayana, was there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think just adding in the piece around safety planning and making sure she's actually connected to adequate, like making sure that the safety planning strategies are culturally responsive. And also the piece about the medical piece. Well, medical and law enforcement, you could definitely pick up on the fact that if it wasn't outright anti-Blackness, it was at least colorism, where if you couldn't see bruises on a darker skinned person, you just assume they're not there, but that's not true. And there are plenty of resources. Like we have UV lights basically that show bruises on darker skin. So there are plenty of strategies to help bolster these different systems. But I think also making sure that you are actually going back to the system to hold them accountable is really important. So connecting them with a TA provider, connecting them with your program to get some more training so that they actually understand these things. And definitely around law enforcement who identified her as a primary aggressor, like that needs to be addressed. So making sure to not simply pick up with the survivor and leave off the accountability piece for the system as well.
Right. Right. Thank you. There was it was Michelle Jacobs who had highlighted in her article in 2017 that even jurisdictions that have this policy of identifying the primary aggressor before making an arrest, which has been the preferred policy, that, for example, that many advocates had highlighted, is not always going to be beneficial for Black women because of these stereotypes that Black women are more aggressive. And I really like the accountability piece, definitely. So that is all I had for today. If folks have any questions, we have a few minutes for that. You could also email, you can email me after the webinar if there's anything that comes up later on. You can also email Ayana, and just thank you everyone for participating. We really appreciate it. Any information on homelessness? I don't have any right now, but I can definitely look into it and get back to you. That's a great question. When will the recording be available? I believe it will be in like maybe about a few days to a week after the webinar. Suzanne asked, when you mentioned that Black women were arrested, were Black men also arrested? So what I could say about that is that Carolyn West had highlighted a study that I think there were of Black couples who were both arrested for domestic violence, some heterosexual couples. So yes, in that case, Black men were also arrested. Can we get a copy of the slides? I believe that's a great question. I believe that there was a copy of the slides that was sent around earlier today before the webinar. But if you don't have it, please feel free to email me and I can send you a copy. And after the webinar is over, the evaluation will pop up on the screen. And we would really appreciate if folks could take a minute to fill out the evaluation, because we do read your evaluations and we use them to inform future training. So we really appreciate any input you can provide. Also, if any of your organizations are interested in receiving training from ASISTA, where we would come to your organization or to an event, for example, that your organization is holding, if ASISTA is able to travel, please let me know after this. You could send me an email to let me know if you are interested in that sort of training. And Suzanne said that the numbers on detainment and deportations, does it include how many are represented by an attorney? I'm not sure. I will look into that and get back to you, because that's also really important. Having access to legal counsel, that makes a big difference. Thank you, Karen, for your participation. Okay, well, thank you all so much, and I hope you all have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Bye.